Hi and welcome to my OCR A-Level Biology revision session with me, Christine. So today's lesson I want to look at the management of environmental resources and human activities. Now be aware the examples that I'm going to go into were part of the old specification. So this is the exams that were sat last year. Now they've removed the names of these examples from your specification if you're sitting your exam this year in 2025. However, they have informed us as teachers to still use them as examples. So in your exam, they will give you some information and they will expect you to pull out of that what you can. So they're not expecting you to memorize any of this content. So just be aware, it's about your application of how management of these environmental resources can be done in a way that ensures that both the human activity is enabled as well as the ecosystem being managed. So the first one is the Masai Mara. Now, this is a savanna ecosystem. So what this tells us is that this is basically made up of grasslands and woodlands, open plains, scattered shrubs, trees, and there are lots of large mammals here. So we have a way in which we need, as humans, to use the land. So the people here will use the land for livestock grazing. We have a mammal, which is going to be a primary consumer. It is going to feed on the producers, the plants within this ecosystem. So this is where they're going to expect you to put the links together. So when we have livestock that are going to be grazing, what we actually need to be aware of is how that would have a negative effect on the ecosystem. So if we allow animals to graze too much, what that could do is that could deplete the producers to a point which means that they can't recover. So it's important that you note that any type of grazing that is allowed needs to be limited. And in this case, it could be limited to areas such as the edge of the reserve. Now, you will note up in my corner, I've said some management techniques which can be applied to most things. Limiting the areas to be visited, controlling the movement of livestock. So by controlling the movement of livestock, what we can do is we can not only control the fact that they could be overgrazing occurring, we can also control the fact that these animals may actually carry diseases which could then be transported around. So it's important to understand that they will expect you to link it together with other subject areas. Another management technique is anti-poaching measures. We've got replanting of native species or having hunting quotas and seasonal bans. So these are basically management techniques can be applied to lots of different examples. You just have to relate it to whatever they give you in the exam question. So another thing that happens in South Kenya is the removal of the acacia bushes. Now these are ones which would cause problems. Now, if they remove too many of these, if they remove these woody plants, there is a risk of soil erosion. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to ensure that we are managing how much of it is removed for the need of the humans to build their shelters, to build their furniture, to build the different materials that they require, but also not having a negative effect on the environment, which could, for example, cause risk of soil erosion. So it's important that you are thinking about what have they told me and what can I then relate that to. So basically what we have done is in most places we have the conservation trusts that are there to ensure that there's conservation of endangered animals, that there's research and ecotourism that make sure that the people who live in these areas are able to get enough money from their land, but also ensuring that it doesn't have a detrimental effect on the environment. So some of the problems with management techniques are things like fenced off areas prevents a natural migration for some animals. Having legal hunting to cull excess animals means that you have to be constantly monitoring that population size. Well, you have to have trained people, you have to have people to be able to do this, and being able to control that takes time and money. Also, you could have the fact that you've got people who would try and poach. So if people are going to poach, you need people there who are going to be anti-poaching measures. They could be guards that go around deterring it, obviously linking it to Module 4 and conservation in the CITES agreement of the trade of endangered species. So remember that all of this is going to interlink with other topic areas. And obviously a problem with management technique is that you actually could end up with more competition and disease spreading between the livestock and the wild animals. So it's always important to think about what are the pros and what are the cons in the example that they've given you. So there's lots of different ones that they will give you. Could be they look at the Terai region in Nepal. It's lowlands, it's well-watered floodplain, so therefore it's very fertile land. And it's a main agricultural region, very high population. However, because there's a high population density, 7 million people, deforestation for agriculture and timber sales. Habitats being destroyed, soils eroding, that exacerbates those monsoon flooding. Closer contact with wild animals, therefore there's more likely to be either predation or disease spreading. And the WWF have worked very hard to try to conserve this area. So things like local community forestry groups ensure that there's sustainable forest management. If you haven't checked out my video on timber production and sustainability, that is something to look at that's linking to this topic area. But it is important to note things like harvesting rules, rates and prices for the products to ensure that it is a sustainable management technique so the ecosystem are not affected in a negative way. Now, it's important that we do promote the sustainable agriculture. So therefore, productions of fruits and vegetables in the hills and mountain areas ensures the soil and water is conserved, improves the economic resilience, and also can promote biodiversity and climate adaptation. So it's important to note, whatever they give you as an example, you have to think about how there is a positive side of it and a negative, and what would that mean? Promoting biodiversity, if you have fruit, that fruit is the food source potentially for some of the organisms, and therefore you will find primary consumers are able to feed. If primary consumers are there, you are then going to have secondary consumers and so forth. If you have plants that are available within the hills and mountain areas, that is then going to allow for the transpiration. So linking to your transport and plants module, transpiration means more likely to be precipitation because of the cloud formation. We also have improving irrigation facilities. They develop efficient irrigation systems, ensuring that the equitable access to the water resources are there. So there's lots of different things that we can do to promote the sustainable agriculture within the Terai region. Now, do remember, you don't have to memorize any of this. They would give you an example and they expect you to then pull out of that example where that links to your other knowledge. So water resources, we know that water is a solvent property, or has a solvent property, therefore can have dissolved substances in it. But we also know that water is able to transmit diseases. So it's important that you think about how all of this interlinks. Multiple cropping, increasing the yield, reducing the risk of crop failure. Nitrogen fixing crops, legumes, linking to, if you haven't checked out my lesson on the nitrogen cycle, this is where that comes in, enhancing that soil fertility by putting nitrates into the soil, because if we've got nitrates in the soil, they have been there because of the nitrogen fixing bacteria, your azotobacter, which are found in the soil. You also have growing crop resistance, so reducing dependency on chemical pesticides, linking to manipulating genomes potentially, or improving fertilization techniques using organic fertilizers and compost. So looking at the ecosystems topic area and how nutrients need to be recycled. The other ones that they have done in the past that they could look at going down is the likes of the peat bog. So the peat bog is a rare and threatened habitat. It is amazing if you get the chance to go and walk in the hilltops in, for example, the Peak District. You'll get to see that these peat bogs are present. They take thousands of years to form, and about 90% has actually diminished over the last 100 years. Now, the environment is very wet, spongy ground, and it has decomposing vegetation. That is what peat is. Now, it's important to note decomposing vegetation. We have got microorganisms that are going to be breaking down the nutrients in the vegetation that is therefore going to be used as a source for respiration within these decomposers that will therefore release carbon into the atmosphere. But actually what you also get is you actually get the peat bogs are a carbon sink. Peat bogs actually store carbon, and that helps with the mitigated climate change. So if the carbon dioxide levels within the atmosphere get too high, having peat bogs as a way of storing the carbon, that is a good way to reduce the carbon dioxide levels within the atmosphere. When the peat bogs are dried, they can then actually be used as a fuel source, which releases energy. Now, the conditions for the peat bogs is that it has to be acidic and it has to be anaerobic. So that makes it a really unique ecological niche, which means only certain organisms that can survive within those conditions actually thrive there. So the biodiversity is very unique. It supports a wide range of these plants, which are adapted to having low nutrient, wet conditions, and also provides a habitat for and food for many animal species. So we need to make sure that we are maintaining these ecosystems. So what is the way in which we use them to help us as a human population? Well, we do what's known as soil improvement. Farmers use the peat bog to improve their soil structure, increase the acidity, benefits their crops. They can use it as moisture regulation, retaining the moisture during dry periods and preventing excess water from killing the plant roots. And they can use it for grazing for their livestock. So it's important you look at where this would interlink with other subject areas. The movement of water into plant roots is by osmosis. If there is too much water, that will have a negative effect on the movement of water that could potentially kill roots. So it's important that you understand that they will link this potentially to module 3, transport in plants, or the grazing of the animals. That is going to potentially cause the loss of moss species. If you're losing species, that was a food source for the consumers. That could have an effect on a food chain. The soil compaction could cause a problem if they are walking around as they're grazing. They're going to compact that soil together, therefore making it less penetrable. That looks at succession, those organisms that can actually impact the soil are the only ones that will thrive to begin with until that soil is broken up again. And also you have the problem of erosion. So this topic area is interlinked so much with all the other topic areas. So how do we do sustainable management then? Well, we have the environmental stewardship scheme. We pay farmers to use the peat bogs sustainably. Runoff reduction, block the ditches, preventing the runoff that could come, because obviously this is a wet environment. The areas are wet. If there's too much water, that could lead to runoff. So you might want to actually create ditches which are going to drain away some of that water and then block those ditches off to prevent the runoff. So that's one way in which you can do it in a sustainable way. Tree seedlings are removed. Removing the young trees will reduce that transpiration. Transpiration means more water vapor in the atmosphere that will then condense in the clouds and you'll get precipitation. To reduce that, remove the trees in that area. That will sustainably manage the area. And also controlling of grazing, when they are allowed to go out and graze, where they're allowed to go and graze as well. And then you have other environmentally sensitive ecosystems such as the Galapagos Islands. Again, this is all linking back to the same management techniques. Limit areas to be visited, controlling the movement of livestock, anti-poaching, replanting of native species, hunting quotas and seasonal bans. So the human activity, we introduced non-native species, unfortunately, and that had a big knock-on effect. We destroyed habitats. We also brought organisms which then predated on other organisms. So hunting giant tortoises for food was a real big issue. So how do we stop that? And we also had the goats that outcompeted the giant tortoise. The other way we can do it is we control the human activity. Park rangers, limiting human access. Only a set number of people are allowed to actually go and visit the Galapagos Islands in specific time periods. Controlling the migration that occurs and strict controls over the movement of introduced animals. And then you have other environmentally sensitive ecosystems like Antarctica, Snowdonia. So it's really important as you're looking at all of these that you note the management techniques are the same. It just depends on what they have given you as the example as to what is the control methods that need to be used. The Lake District in England. So these were all the case studies which were there in the last specification. These were the examples, and I had an argument with myself back and forth whether or not I would put this video out there, but I do think because they have stated that teachers should still use these, it means that they're more likely going to give you a question which has some of these examples, but everything you need to be able to answer the question will be in the information in the stem of the question. So I hope you've liked this video, and if you have, then please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you haven't already done so, do check out my revision platform, www.aiqchat.com.